Thank you all for joining us. Good evening. Everybody's coming in here. Give it a minute. We have a very special guest, obviously, today, so we're excited to have everyone joining us on a Monday night. So, good evening, everyone. Thank you again for joining us on our ongoing Zoom series where we talk with activists, intellectuals, elected officials, candidates about all things Palestine. My name is Omar Kurdi. I'm going to be moderating today's session. And before we get started, I just want to remind you all to follow us on our various social media pages, Instagram, WhatsApp, Facebook, LinkedIn, wherever else you find us. We'll be putting the link in the chat, and keep in touch so you can find out about all the activities and events we have planned and that are coming up. We'll also have some time towards the end of today's session for questions from the audience. So if you have a question, please make sure you put it in the chat box and we'll try to get through as many questions as we can. And now, without further ado, we are honored to have with us, joining us today, Dr. Cornel West. Dr. West is a scholar and an academic, a theologian, philosopher, writer, civil rights activist, and leader. And he's currently happens to be running for president of the United States. Dr. West, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so very much, my dear brother. And I just want to salute Orange County for justice in Palestine. You all are a force for good in a very grim moment. And I thank you, and it's a blessing to be here.
Well, we are honored to have you. We know how busy you are on the campaign trail, fighting the good fight. And so it's really our honor to have you. I wanted to, if we could start off, I wanted to ask you about a poll that recently came out. Quinnipiac had a poll just a few days ago of African-American voters. And the poll, if I'm getting this right, 56% of African-American voters were indicated they would vote for Genocide Joe, President Biden, but that there was, in fact, a three-way tie for second place between Donald Trump, the likely Republican nominee, RFK Jr., and yourself. And, when I saw that, I was sort of taken aback, given that there's been basically a media blackout as far as your campaign is concerned, and 24/7 coverage of Trump and RFK Jr., not to mention the millions of dollars in corporate and super PAC money that they're both receiving. And in spite of all that, you are hanging in there with no big money behind you and no media coverage. What do you make of that poll?
Well, you can imagine, brother, that for me, the standards are really truth, justice, and love, and have little to do with just polls of money or pecuniary flow. Now, of course, money has its role. And Biden's got about 71 million sitting around, and Trump's got another 65 million, and RFK Jr. has got about 31 million, and we're lucky to have 500,000, a little more than 500,000. So you're right. You could see the discrepancy and the unbelievable disparity. But most importantly, though, brother, when you're trying to stand on integrity, honesty, decency, courage, telling the truth, keeping your vision focused on the most vulnerable, wherever they are, the poor, working classes, no matter what color, those peoples who are colonized, occupied, subjugated, whatever form the structure of domination takes. That's where the solidarity has to be. So that in the end, as you can imagine, it's not going to be about the polls, though, brother. It's going to be about the moral quality of your stance. Is going to be about the depth of your courage. It's going to be about the scope of your compassion. And so I'm much more concerned about wrestling with what it means to be human as opposed to what it means to be a politician. Now, of course, I'm in the context of electoral politics, but it's simply the spillover of a freedom movement in electoral politics. So I'm not a garden variety politician at all. No, not at all. This campaign's a moment in a movement, and it's a movement of a whole host of folk, Martin Kings and Fannie Lou Hamers and Edward Zaids and Rabbi Heschels and Dorothy Days and Stokely Carmichaels. One can go on and on and on of people who have had the courage to stand up, speak their minds, straighten their backs up, and then be willing to take the hits, be willing to pay the cost and bear the burden. And unfortunately, we're at such a low moment in America now, it's hard to find politicians, hard to find public figures who could say a mumbling word about the indescribable genocide that's taken place right before our very eyes. And it's a very sobering moment. You know, sometimes you begin to wonder how wretched can we human beings actually be to each other. Now we know there's history, long history of massacres and pogroms and lynchings and Holocaust and the Nakbas and so forth across countries and across civilizations, across empires. But to see this on TV every day, though, man, just say, wow, we've got to hold together. Solidarity, and in so many ways, has got to be a last word in the face of catastrophe.
Can I ask you, how do you navigate that? I mean, there's a line you have to walk between running a campaign where you're trying to win votes and then speaking truth to power. I mean, how do you navigate that binary?
Yeah, I mean, of course, you speak truth no matter what. You speak truth to the relatively powerless. You speak truth to the powerful and be ready to be hit hard. And you speak the truth to yourself because, see, in the end, you can't sustain a longevity of commitment to integrity without checking yourself. And see, for most politicians, it's a brand. But for those of us who have a calling, it's a cause. And the qualitative difference between a brand, which is a market strategy, electoral politics, Machiavellian calculation, this interest group here, this interest group there, versus a cause, something you live for, something you die for, something you feel in your bones, the fire in your heart. And you speak based on that fire mediated with your own critical reflection. And so it is a tightrope, my brother, but it's one that you want to stay on because the last thing we need now is more garden variety politicians who are just bought off by big money and big title, big position, big status, and sell their souls for a mess of pottage. And this is the litmus test. Genocide right now in Gaza is a litmus test. Not just because this historical moment is so crucial regarding the larger forces in the world, the American empire being revealed, tied to this killing machine and enabling this kind of ethnic cleansing and support of apartheid and genocidal assault. But it's also a matter of testing who we are as human beings, not just as Americans, not just as citizens, as human beings. Are we willing to step up and tell the truth and bear the burden and go against the grain?
And, you know, on that note, just yesterday, maybe in the most profound way, a fellow American, in fact, an airman, an armed services member, in an act of protest against what he was participating in his own words, that he was complicit in, immolated himself in front of the Israeli embassy in Washington, D.C., and in fact succumbed to his wounds many hours later. And it's been, I think, the press has more or less picked up on the issue. What's your reaction to the Aaron Bushnell story?
Well, you know, first thing I want to do is pray for his loved ones, and I want to acknowledge the extraordinary courage, extraordinary commitment to be willing to pay the ultimate cost based on principle, based on integrity. Because I recall when he was walking on his way to the embassy, he made it quite clear that this for him was a matter of moral principle. that he could not live with himself, given his complicity with something as barbaric as genocide. To be complicitous with something as bestial as genocide. And his last words, free Palestine. Based on morality, spirituality. He himself, I don't think it's a Palestinian. He looked like, a vanilla brother to me. I don't know his full background, but as a human being, he's making a moral choice, and he's sending a sign, a symbol to the world in the most concrete way, where his flesh on fire, with his flesh on fire, to send a message. Shame on you, America. Shame on you, Biden. Shame on you, Harris. Shame on you, Kirby. Shame on you, Sullivan. Shame on you, Austin. Shame on you, Senate. Shame on you, Congress. Shame on all of those officials. And it spills over even beyond that. We could talk about pastors in churches, rabbis in synagogues, imams in mosques, if they have not stepped forward. Entertainers in Hollywood, where are your voices? And you and I think, have to acknowledge, though, brother, that, Lord, if this were white Europeans, 15,000 precious white European children killed in a matter of months, it'd be a qualitatively different response. Qualitatively different response. If Palestinians were doing this to Jews, it wouldn't only be a qualitatively different response. Biden himself would allocate money for the Jewish version of Hamas and call them freedom fighters. See, so that there's an element here of racism, of chauvinism, of tribalism, of the supremacy of Europeans vis-a-vis non-Europeans. And we simply cannot have that. We have to be in solidarity with any group of any color who is undergoing this kind of barbaric attack, murder, maiming, and of course, with the attack on the hospitals, we've yet to see, what the diseases, how the diseases, unfold, and that increases the deaths. I mean, it's just so hard to keep track of all of it, because genocide, as we know, is not just the killing of precious human beings. It is the undermining of the conditions of any human life. And that has consequences far, far, far beyond the particular murders that we're witnessing.
And when the story of Aaron Bushnell came out, the image, and then there was, in the internet, at least on Twitter, you see these images of the Buddhist monk in Vietnam who also engaged in immolation in protest to what was happening during the war in Vietnam. And there's so many parallels. I mean, do you think, are we in a moment similar to that era, where, and Dr. King talked about it, the three evils, including militarism? I mean, is this a moment like that?
Oh, I think it is. I think it definitely is. The difference was that in the 1960s, the American empire was on its ascendancy. American empire actually emerges as the #1 empire in the world, 1945, and becomes the mightiest military empire in the history of the world. It peaks in 1990 or so. But in the 60s, it was on the way up. America has been declining since 1990. The decay, the decline, the military overreach, 800 military units around the world, special operations in over 130 countries, 62 cents for every dollar going to the military industrial complex, with the war manufacturers making big, big, big money. But when it comes to healthcare, education, when it comes to jobs with a living wage, when it comes to safe communities, and so on, it's hard to get a penny. Austerity for that face. But the face of war, boundless money, trillions of dollars we've spent since 2001, for example, with the invasion of Iraq. So that there are parallels in terms of the moral witness of the precious Buddhist monk who was willing to pay the ultimate price. And now Brother Aaron Bushnell willing to pay the ultimate price with setting oneself on fire, killing oneself in that way. But it's a different historical moment because America is now slowly moving off the center of the historical stage. The internal decay and the external decline. And that's a very grim time to live. I mean, you and I just have to be living in this particular moment where it's like the Roman Empire. You got military overreach, you got the corruption of elites of both parties. So we have the choice between neo-fascist Pied Piper with Trump leading the country toward the second civil war, and we have Genocide Joe leading the world toward World War III, not just in the Middle East with the escalating regional war, but with Russia and with China, mediated with Ukraine and Taiwan. And so what is American citizens supposed to do? Well, 70% say we don't want to choose either one of these folks. But they're locked in, other than some of us who say there's got to be an alternative. There's got to be a different option, a different choice that we can make based on our vision, based on the lens through which we view the world, based on our willingness to bear witness to the truths that we tell, and also to provide some exemplars for the younger generation. Because the younger generation in some ways is more despairing than that of my own, because they see more clearly ecological catastrophe. They see more clearly the consequences of organized greed in Wall Street and Silicon Valley, the 1% that own 90% of the wealth, the 3 individuals that own wealth equivalent to 50% of US fellow citizens. 160 million people have wealth equivalent to 3. Now that's worse than the Roman Empire. That's worse than Julius Caesar once he crossed the Rubicon. You got that fundamental shift from a republic to an empire and expands the empire. So that, but then you also have, though, in addition to military overreach and the corruption of elite, citizens feeling powerless, obsessed with titillation with the gladiators in the Coliseum, just like we've got the Super Bowl. Where was it this year? I think in Las Vegas. There's nothing wrong with that, but it's an escapism. You see, it's spectacle. And you get all of the martial, militaristic sensibilities manifest in the clashing. And so you got militarized policy abroad. You got militarized schools. I was in school the other day. You got more policemen and you had nurses and counselors. Well, yeah, how can you sustain any kind of qualitative community with that imbalance? That militarizing sensibility is shot through every nook and cranny of the culture. And you can imagine the impact it has on our precious young folk. My God, what are they?
In fact, I heard an interview of yours recently. You had said 46 or 48% of Americans don't even participate in the electoral process because they're so alienated from the process. They're effectively disenfranchised from the process because, or at least largely because, the 2 political parties don't even speak to them. They don't speak to their needs, their interests, their concerns. They're too busy catering to the needs of their actual base, which is the billionaire class and the military-industrial complex, big business, while ordinary voters are basically left to fend for themselves. So, I mean, your campaign comes at a pivotal moment, and I think, to your credit, you are speaking to those issues, and I think that's why you're having the successes that you've been having, and hopefully will continue to be having. I did want to ask you.
You're right, but I think that percentage is about 40% now. 4 out of 10, 2 out of 5. That's a high level of apathy. It's a high level of non-engagement in the political process. You're absolutely right.
And recently, I think it was maybe a week or so ago, the New York Times ran a story about the AME Church calling for an end to U.S. aid for Israel. And the clergy members who were interviewed for the story had said that, African Americans being the Democratic Party's most loyal voting bloc, and that the church is viewed as essential to President Biden's campaign and to a potential second term. What do you think that says about the direction of the Democratic Party and where what arguably is supposed to be his most loyal bloc of voters are, where their heads are?
Yeah, I think that the degree to which the Black community more broadly wakes up and sees Biden for who he is. I mean, Biden is the architect of a crime against humanity called the mass incarceration regime with the 1994 crime bill. You see him speak on the floor of Congress where he talks about the super predators who ought to be taken to jail, throw away the key, they're less than. I mean, the language is just unbelievable. Now, he finally apologized for it when he ran for president a few years ago. But that's who Biden is in terms of his attitude toward poor people, in terms of his attitude toward persons who he thinks don't vote, and therefore he has no accountability vis-a-vis them. Now, he was able to hide and conceal that when Obama plucked him out and he became Obama's vice president. Now, he and Obama, of course, bailed out Wall Street rather than everyday people. They increased mass incarceration. Not one Wall Street executive went to jail, even given the massive crimes of insider trading and market manipulation and fraudulent activities and predatory lending and so on. But he did rebrand himself, as they would say these days. And yet now we see, oh, lo and behold, that rebranding is getting thinner and thinner and thinner because of these Black folk who partly fell in love with him because they thoroughly fell in love with Obama and thought that somehow he had been completely rebranded, but he's got all of these lies and these crimes tied to him. And they follow him, and they ought to haunt him. You see, they ought to haunt him because the militarizing connected with mass incarceration. And I've taught in prison for 41 years, my dear brother Omar. And, at its peak, just a few years ago, almost 50% of those who were incarcerated were in there for nonviolent offenses. Now, we can understand murder and rape and so forth, okay. They need to be rehabilitated and educated and so forth. But nonviolent offenses locked into these kind of ugly, vicious spaces of incarceration. Well, that's Biden. He was bragging about. Same was true with the invasion of Iraq under Bush. So he's got a long history of militarizing, both at home and supporting militarism abroad. Now, when it comes to genocide, you would think, oh my God, how low can you go? And then still can't call for ceasefire, vetoed 3 times. I mean, to me, that makes him a war criminal. I know I've said that on many occasions that people have come at me and said I shouldn't use that language. I said, I'm just trying to tell the truth. He's trying to tell the truth. To enable war crimes, to give military equipment, the bombs and the surveillance, intelligence, to ensure that you can kill more effectively vulnerable, precious human beings, in this case, vulnerable, precious Palestinians, that makes you a war criminal. And we have to be just very candid about that. It's not a matter of demonizing him or making him into a devil. No, he's a human being who chooses devilish policies that enable a barbaric genocide, period.
And that is apparent, it looks like the way things are headed is that it's going to have uh, very poor consequences for him in the November election. I mean, I think the most recent polls, he's polling very unfavorably, favor lowest approval rating ever. I think in the low 30s. I mean, it seems like he's willing to risk everything, and it just doesn't make a lot of sense that you're willing to back this genocide to the hilt against your own interests, against your own electoral interests, and risking so much that a Trump presidency, nobody wants, no progressive really wants or desires a Trump presidency, and there's so much risk with that. I mean, people are talking about it's a threat to democracy, and it's a threat to women's rights and immigrant rights and criminal justice reform and so many other things. And the between Biden and the party, the attitude is just so cavalier that they're willing to risk it all for the sake of this genocide. And if people like you or me say, well, we don't want this, we want something else, uh, we're accused of, if you don't vote for Biden, you're effectively voting for Trump. I think Gretchen Whitmer just said something to that effect the other day. How do you respond to that?
Well, I tell you this, my brother, I come from a great black people who Frederick Douglass and others raised the question when they had to vote between a liberal slaveholder and a conservative slaveholder. He said, I'm not voting for either one. I'm an abolitionist. I'm voting for the abolition of slavery. So he founded the Liberty Party. And that Liberty Party finally, as you know, became connected to Republican Party. And here comes Abe Lincoln. Lincoln, of course, has his own white supremacist sensibilities, but he was a vanilla brother who was willing to learn and listen from the abolitionist movement. He listened to Harriet Tubman. He listened to Frederick Douglass, and it led toward the abolition of slavery. So the social movements have tremendous impact, even as they're trying to reform systems. Now, I'm calling for a fundamental transformation of the system, but reform has its role and it has its place. And so for me, if I have to choose between a neo-fascist heading toward Civil War II and genocide Joe heading toward World War III, I'm not gonna act like it's a lesser evil and feel good about myself. Not at all. Either one of them lead toward consequences that are difficult to even conceive of. You have to be able to create some kind of alternative. And I say, well, you're wasting your vote. No, they have to earn our vote. They don't own our vote. They've got to earn it. And if they're not earning it, then they don't deserve it. And can you imagine, for example, I mean, the idea of Biden wanting to go to Dearborn, I've been to Dearborn a number of times and have some wonderful brothers and sisters there. Going to Dearborn as a politician and saying, well, you should still vote for me because my calculus of interest group leads me to say that you should vote for someone who's facilitating dropping bombs on your grandmother. This is a human issue. It's a moral issue. It's a spiritual issue. Don't reduce the rich humanity of my family to your Machiavellian calculation of electoral politics. That itself has its own disgusting status to me. It would be somebody said, well, you have to vote for the liberal slaveholder, even though that's the same one who's raping your grandmother. Hey, I'm not voting for him, period. I'm taking a stand. Almost the last stand I can take in terms of my humanity itself not being completely crushed or called into question. And we feel like Brother Aaron, like, hey, is the only option just to set yourself on fire? Well, we understand, Aaron. That's why we view you as a martyr. You are. You're bearing witness, and that's what martyr and witness mean the same thing. And of course, what we have to do is we've got to have a fire inside of us. It don't necessarily have to have a fire that sets our bodies on fire for us to die, but we have to have a fire inside of us that says, look, we have to take a moral and a stand that has political consequences. We understand that. We do understand that. But we're not going to somehow be some spectators or somehow the detached choosers who are calculating our interests vis-a-vis two politicians, both of whom are promoting the most gangster-like policies conceivable, especially Biden, not in the Middle East and partly here, Trump very much here. And of course, Trump would probably do the same thing in the Middle East too.
And Malcolm X had that quote about the difference between a Northern Democrat and a Southern Democrat. One's the Southern Democrat's a wolf and the Northern Democrat's a fox. But either way, they're both canines, and either way either way you're going to be in the doghouse, one way or the other.
No, that's true. That's true, Malcolm. Malcolm's telling the truth now. I'll tell you.
And so part of the issue is that I think it's bad. It's not only is it morally problem, but it's bad politics. It's bad politics because, in fact, I think the Times had ran a story back in January about these black pastors that were pressuring Biden to call for a ceasefire, and they went on to say that the congregants in the church were, and I'm quoting here, so dismayed by the president's posture toward the war that their support for his reelection bid could be imperiled. So, I mean, it's a real conundrum because you're in a situation where because of these politics as usual, the politics as usual is going to lead us to a situation, or could lead us to a situation where we end up with a Trump presidency, or the nightmare that entails. So, what is your message to sort of the grassroots as to how to push back against that kind of politics?
I was blessed to be actually preach at Mother Emanuel. I'm not a minister, I'm just a lay Christian, but they asked me to preach at Mother Emanuel there in Charleston, South Carolina, AME Church, which is exactly where Biden gave that speech, exactly where those precious 9 people were murdered by a very sick white supremacist. One of the things I was concerned about conveying was, what does it mean to have a president of the United States in a church where innocent people were killed by white supremacists, and he, speaking to those black folk, can't say a mumbling word about the bombs being dropped in Gaza, facilitated by his own position and office and actions, so that the connection between the killing of those innocent 9 and the killing of the innocent 30,000 or so is never made. What I find significant about that in terms of where we are now is to say, well, what we seem to be looking for is the impossible, but when we pull it off, they're going to say it's inevitable. And what I mean is this, though, brother, that I do believe I have a chance of winning. I'm not convinced that Biden is actually even going to be the candidate. He might run out of gas. The pressure might be so intense, the polls collapsing, his own cognition declining, that they'll have to go to a B team. Trump himself may be on the way to jail. We don't know. This is in real time. We have to be constant. We have to be consistent. We have to be persevering in our commitment to our truths, to our justice seeking, and to our willingness to pay a cost. And therefore, I don't want to act as if the decisions have already been made for us. I think things are still incomplete and unfinished. And people say, "Oh, Brother West, you must be living in a dream world." Well, yes, I got some freedom dreams. That's true. Oh, I very much have freedom dreams, definitely. But I also believe that whatever the present moment is, that catastrophe will never have the last word. Never, ever, ever. And that's true in Gaza. When you look in the faces of those precious Palestinians undergoing these vicious attacks, And you still see some of them. Peace. Victory. You still see tremendous dignity, resilience. We have been on intimate terms with catastrophe for a long, long, long time. And you will never, ever crush our spirits. You might be able to crush our bodies for the moment, but never our spirits. There will be new bodies and new persons coming along to inculcate that spirit of resistance and resilience and calling for dignity and equality and freedom. And you see, that's the kind of thing that cuts so much deeper than any of these mainstream politicians understand. They just don't understand it. You know, for them, it's really just about the next election. It's about the next calculation. And it's not the next move you can make as if you're talking about pieces in a chess game or something. No, we're talking about actual, genuine, fleshified human beings who resist and have resilience, but also can be killed, can be murdered, can be maimed. And how do we stay in contact with the best of what's inside of us, the best of what's inside of the histories of any oppressed people, Palestinian, Black folk, Dalits? We can go on and on and on in this regard. One of the challenges these days is there any place left in our moment of barbarity for morality and spirituality? Because if it's just a matter of what politicians are preoccupied with, which is just raw power, if it's just a matter of raw power and no concerns for humanity and morality and spirituality, doesn't that mean that the ecological crisis that our young people are facing more than we older folk because they have to live many, many decades after us? Does that mean that the greed of the fossil fuel industry pushes us off the cliff as a planet? Does that mean that there'll be fascisms everywhere, not just Trump in the United States, but fascist parties everywhere you look, because people's sense of disorder will be so overwhelming, they'll be looking for a tyrant to impose order, to make things great again? And of course, that's a theme that you see in Hungary. It's a theme that you see in Sweden. It's a theme you see in Italy. It's a theme that you see in Brazil, and so on. We can go on and on and on in this regard. What a time to be alive, my brother.
You're describing, what's a bleak and dire prospects that we're facing, but you still sound hopeful. And, a lot of the folks on here today, I mean, to be honest, hope is it feels like a pipe dream. So how do you stay hopeful? How do you stay so hopeful?
Well, one, we got to draw a radical distinction between optimism and hope. I'm not an optimist at all. I've never been an optimist. There's never overwhelming evidence to allow us to infer that things are going to get better if we keep doing what we do. But I'm a prisoner of hope. That's qualitatively different, because a prisoner of hope understands hope is both a virtue as well as a verb. Hope is a form of action. A lot of times hope is a consequence of action. You see, when you and I and the others march downtown LA or march in downtown DC, or continually remain connected to any folks who are struggling. I was just at Skid Row just a couple of weeks ago with Pastor Q, 40,000 folk in the middle of LA with all the money and billionaires and so forth. These folk don't have all the anything, right? No, it's our actions that help generate the hope. And hope cannot be sustained if you're not acting, if you're not pushing yourself, if you're not involved in solidarity movements, if you're not in communities that themselves are trying to make the world better. When you look up as a spectator, you say, oh my God, it's David versus Goliath. But then when you put your head back down and say, Brother Omar, let's hold hands, brother. Let's hit it. Let's move with our sisters. Let's move with our brothers. Let's continue to put pressure to bear. Let's never give up. That's hope in its most concrete form. And that means you intervene in the present to authorize a grander future. And when more and more people awaken, more and more people see what you see and feel what you feel and want to act the way you act, then you got a movement on your hands. And you see the movement of everyday people and organized people in the end is always more powerful than just organized money at the top that's trying to pacify folk, you see. And so in that way, the moral and the spiritual are forms of power. Politics has its kind of power. Money and economics, finances have their kind of power. But morality has its power. Spirituality has its power in communities as we stay in motion. That's the key. Stay, because I come from a blues people, though, brother. You know the blues. The blues is not optimistic, but it's not pessimistic. It's full of hope. It's full of hope in the sound. When B.B. King said, nobody loves me but my mama, and she might be jiving too. See, that's the blues, brother. And he sings it with such style, with a smile, but the words are just so grim and dim. Good morning, heartache, says Billie Holiday. Strange fruit. That's American terrorism, right? Black bodies swaying in the southern breeze off of those trees of lynching. There ain't no optimism in that song at all. No, not at all. But the song itself is full of hope. The song itself is full of people themselves willing to organize, willing to bear witness, willing to fight, willing to go down swinging, as it were. I saw somebody mention the great Mary Baraka. Nobody like him in his classic blues people. He was under, he has Leroy Jones. His name Leroy Jones initially. He renamed himself to the book. Has Leroy Jones on the cover. But it's the same genius. It's the same great artist. And he's a blues man to the core. I was just with Reggie Workman 2 nights ago in New York. We did a special program at the New School on Black History Month. And he played the bass for John Coltrane's quartet. And I'm telling you, love supreme, man. John Coltrane. Elvin Jones on the drums, McCoy Tyner on the piano, Jimmy Garrison or Reggie Workman on the bass. See, that's not optimism. That's not pessimism. That's the enactment. That's the fleshification of hope in sound. And we have to have that in our lives. We have to have that in our lives. And Palestinian peoples are probably one of the grandest examples of what it is to wrestle with despair. And despair seems to push you to the edge. And yet at the very, very end, there's this kind of despair will never have the last word. Never, ever, ever have the last word. And of course, Palestinians, like other peoples, you got Muslims, you got Christians, you got secular folk, Edward Zaids and others. But for our precious Muslim brothers and sisters, Allah will have the last word, no matter how much despair we feel. So there's retail despair and there's wholesale despair. To be human is to have retail despair. Everybody wrestles with despair at various moments of their lives. Your mama's funeral and so forth and so on, see. But wholesale, no, Allah will not allow wholesale. There is no God but Allah. Against the idolatry. The idolatry tries to convince you to hold on to just what's in front of you rather than that which is greater than you. And the same would be true for Christian Palestinians. Same would be true for secular Palestinians like Edward Zaid, where in fact resistance and what he called unstoppable predilections for alternatives among the Palestinian peoples. After the Sky, that's his great classic. He wrote after the question of Palestine and after Orientalism. He was my dear brother, as you know, and so I can go on and on talking about his works and his corpus. I love that brother and his wife Marion and his two children.
And he's bitterly missed. He passed too early. If you know,
isn't that the truth? 2003.
He'd have been a powerful voice at this moment. I do want to ask you, and you touched on this in so many different ways. So much of this is perceived as a foreign policy issue, and in reality, I mean, we're talking about, for example, we don't have money to take care of things here at home, education, housing, healthcare, because all this money has to be devoted to endless war and genocide and so on. I mean, how do we link up? And this kind of ties this struggle to all the different struggles that people are going through in this country, whether it's immigrant justice, or women's rights, or a criminal justice reform, poverty. How do we tie these issues together to kind of build a bigger, wider mainstream this issue, so that it's not just seen as a foreign policy issue or an Arab issue or a Muslim issue, that it brings people together, because it is in fact really the deciding issue. I mean, there's so much that comes out of this, and it's a morality test. So how do we bring it to a wider mainstream?
Well, we've got to make the connection between so-called foreign policy and so-called domestic policy. That America is an empire that tries to convince other nations to defer to them. Its relation to Israel is a satellite of the American empire, so that America can itself still be able to gain access to a variety of different things. It could be oil or whatever it is. And at the same time, you've got internal dynamics in American society that make it very difficult for any public figure or any politician to speak his or her mind, because they don't have access to either huge amounts of money with APEC or status in the larger society, which is say you're viewed as anti-Semitic if in fact you have a critique of a vicious Israeli occupation or vicious Israeli genocidal attack. And you have to be willing to counter those kind of claims. No, this is not about hating Jewish brothers and sisters at all. And you got not just the Noam Chomsky's, but if not now, and Jewish Voices for Peace, and a whole wave of courageous Jewish brothers and sisters who are willing to tell the truth, willing to be honest about what is going on here. And so I think we have to argue the way Martin King argued. He said, I have to come to terms with the fact that my own government is the biggest conveyor of violence in the world. He said that in 1967, 1 year before he died. And that is the case. That's just an empirical question. There's other gangsters out there. You got Putin's gangsterism, and the head of Uganda's a gang. I mean, you got a lot of gangsters out there. America doesn't have 100% of the gangsters, but we've got the biggest empire to engage in gangster activities. And what that means is, well, then how do we allow our citizens at home to still be able to live lives that flower and flourish when so many of our priorities are tied to big military, and when so many of the priorities at home are dominated by big money at home, oligarchs and plutocrats, the 1%. And so what happens is, if they can remain with policies where we're at each other's throats, the old traditional divide and conquer strategy of those below, to convince people who are hurting to scapegoat the most vulnerable rather than confront the most powerful. Once you confront the most powerful with solidarity, you've got a challenge. As long as you're scapegoating the most vulnerable, it could be with Black folk, it could be with indigenous peoples, it could be with new immigrants trying to get into the country and so forth. These are vulnerable people. These are vulnerable people. And you see it even in Gaza. I mean, it's amazing to me the degree to which the mainstream press act as if Palestinians are responsible for their own genocide. I mean, how sick can you get? And yet you see these rationalizations over and over and over and over again. They hadn't done this. If they had accepted its peace, 22%, please. I mean, we won't go into all of the so-called two-state solution and so on and so forth. But you see this over and over again. You see, it's kind of rationalization where the persons who are being victimized are fundamentally and primarily responsible for their own victimization. So the IDF, well, no, they're just defending Israel, killing that many children, that many women. Well, they're all shields. All of them are shields. Please, we were born at night, but not last night. Quit lying. What you're essentially saying is that a Palestinian life has less value than a Jewish life. What you're really saying is you have a certain contempt and even hatred of Palestinians, that you would allow this to take place. And that organized hatred is tied to organized greed. And that's precisely the lethal connection that leads toward the doom of every empire. When you get organized greed and organized hatred tied together, there's no space for morality, maturity. There's no space for community. There's no space for democracy at all. And that's in part what we're wrestling with in America. We need to tell America the truth. My campaign, of course, is about reintroducing America to the best of itself. See, Martin King and Edward Said and Rabbi Heschel and Dorothy Day, they are as American as Trump and Biden. It's just that Trump happens to be the worst of America. Biden supporting the genocide in Gaza happens to be the worst of America. There is the best of America. Brother Omar, you are as American as Trump or Biden or anybody else. And you straighten up and stand up and raise your voice and say, I want people to understand that there is the best of America in terms of my concerns about justice and truth and love. I mean, I talk a lot about love because as a Christian, in the end, if you don't have the deep love, and love is precisely about the emptying of yourself, the surrendering of yourself to something greater than you, to be a vessel so that you then can be fundamentally committed to the welfare of others. So you can love your neighbor by being a neighbor, that you can be thankful for your blessings by being a blessing to others. And we've got to be as much neighbors and blessings to our brothers and sisters in Gaza or any other place where people are suffering, in our words and in our deeds.
And on the issue of the role of the media in dehumanizing Palestinians, if I got a dollar for every time the New York Times would say Palestinians die and Israelis are killed, I wouldn't need a job at that point. We are running out of time.
It reminds me when Edward Said and Noam Chomsky, we back in the early 80s, we used to protest against the New York Times to get them to use the word occupation rather than disputed territory. The lies that mainstream journalism was put out about people is overwhelming.
We can have an entire session on the role of the New York Times in perpetuating and enabling this genocide, but we'll have to save that for another time. I do want to try to get some questions from our chat box. There was a question about if there could be a unity or a solidarity ticket between your campaign and the Greens. I know there was some issues there. Ideally, as a progressive voter or left voters, we would love to have a easier option as far as who to vote for in the election. What can we? How do we explain that? Is as far as the having to pick between the Green Party and yourself?
Yeah, you're right. Under ideal circumstances, it would be nice to have one main candidate and have the whole progressive community and the leftist community come together. That, unfortunately, that's simply just not not the case, because every community and every tradition has their history, and these histories too often are shot through with tensions and shot through with strife and so forth. So that you're absolutely right. I think under ideal conditions, that would be very, very nice. And you never know, what happens down the line. I don't impose any kind of closure on these things. But at the moment, I'm just trying to get on the ballot. I'm already on the ballot in Alaska. I'm on the ballot in Oregon, and Alaska, the Aurora Party, Oregon, the Progressive Party. We were just endorsed by a Black party in South Carolina, United Citizens Party. We're nearly there in Utah. We're nearly there in Nebraska. I hope to be on about 45, 48, maybe even 50 states. New York is just so difficult, they give you 42 days, 46,000 signatures. And usually you need almost twice as many, because oftentimes it's the Democratic Party people who are deciding whether your signatures are valid or not. Now in California, we got the Peace and Freedom Party and that nomination process that I'm a part of. And I'm very, very upbeat about that. I hope very much to be on the ballot with the Peace and Freedom Party as I continue to be a part of their nominating process.
And we have our humble endorsement to your campaign. We have OCJP has endorsed the Cornel West for the Peace and Freedom ticket. So
that means much, my brother. That means much, because again, we're talking about heart to heart, soul to soul. Not just a political electoral issue, but just in terms of an affirmation of witness, an affirmation of trying to be a force for good in the world. And to come from your group means much to me, my brother. And I thank you and the others so very, very much.
Well, it's our privilege and our honor, and it's our obligation, actually, given the courageous stance you've taken, not just in the last couple months during this genocide, but over the course of your career and your lifetime. If folks do want to contribute or help your campaign from here in Orange County, how can we go about doing that?
Oh, yes, it would be Cornel West 2024.com. CORNEL, just one L, not like university. With CORNELWEST 2024.com.
And we'll put the link in the chat. I think it's already in there.
Oh, that's
for
beautiful.
Folks that want to get involved and to donate to the campaign. Dr. West, thank you so much for being with us today and for sharing your thoughts. It was a very much needed, uplifting and empowering discussion. Good luck to you on the campaign trail. We are rooting for you, and thank you so much again for being with us.
But thank you, my dear brother, and God bless you, and God bless your precious family and loved ones. Indeed, indeed.
Thank you so much. God bless you.
Stay strong, my brother.